Chapter 2. The Casting. The wind came howling across the marshlands with a million savage voices, driving dark clouds in a swath before it, scything down the brown reeds of autumn in its path. Again he cowered fever-ridden behind the rattling door of his forge, hearing on the blast the echoes of ancient battles upon the fens, the distant, hungry cries of the myriad dead who lay beneath them, arisen now and hunting along the gale. Gusts hammered on the wood like huge hands, huge as the blackened and crumbling fist from which he had snatched that sword. He woke abruptly and lay shivering a moment before he became aware of the soft bed beneath him, the worn richness of the counterpane under his clutching fingers. The chill was all within his dream. The marshlands lay far behind him. But he knew he had not been wholly dreaming. He listened a moment, with a leaden swell of apprehension. The bed-hangings were dark silhouettes against a faint graying of the darkness. Not even a tassel stirred, yet the howling was still in his ears. The threadbare rug slipped underfoot as he swung himself out of bed. The cool air stung his skin, and the smooth slabs his feet as he padded over to the outward window. But this was narrow, and the grill stopped him leaning out far enough to see. The house, like most of any size or age in the old city, faced inward, around its own quadrangle, and presented as blank an aspect as possible to the outward world. He turned and sprinted past the door curtain, out into the open gallery and up the stairs that led to the roof. By the time he came out among the dilapidated tiling, his head was swimming, his heart laboring, a familiar ache burning deep in his chest. The night's labors had spent his strength. He had to steady himself a moment on the crumbling stone parapet before leaning out to look. The city below lay in deep shadow, but bright flecks of firelight flickered here and there, surely too brightly for this ashen half-light at night's end. And though the air hung still as a dusty tapestry, the stormy voices were clearer than ever now, closer, louder, a hungry, savage baying that made him shudder where he stood. The touch of something small and animal on his bare back made him jump. "Small wonder you're shivering," growled Ilse's voice. The Duergar girl reached up to drape a robe round his shoulders. "On your feet no more than a month, and you're gallivanting around in your skin." "I'm all right," he protested, with a resentful shrug. "This would be a warm day where I was born." But he slid his arms into the garment nonetheless, grateful for the warmth of the fur lining. The winter, they said, had been the fiercest in the city's memory, and this spring was hardly warm yet. "Good," she said firmly. "After all, you cannot heal from fevers in just a moment." Elof smiled thinly, glad she was ready to make a joke of the matter. That sudden closing of a mortal wound had opened a wider gulf. That moment of strange recovery had briefly stood like a barrier between him and his friends who witnessed it, like a bare blade tossed on the table between hands poised yet hesitant. Ilse, for all her care of him, had grown warier than any. Only the racking sickness that had come swiftly upon him, a symptom of humanity as it seemed, and some price paid for so terrible a wound, had dispelled their doubts. They had remembered what manner of blade struck the blow, and blamed all strangeness upon that. He did not gainsay them, but as his mind cooled, he knew it was not so. Yet even now his thoughts blurred as he probed them. He understood it no better himself. No better. "The row woke me, too," she muttered, calling him back to himself. What devilry are the humans up to now? Comes this way by the sound. I don't know. I fear. Listen. They heard it clearly, the sound of footsteps, pounding steps, stumbling on the dawn-slick cobbles, running as a man does at the end of his strength, or a quarry a length ahead of the pack. Around the corner of the street below staggered a young man, a boy almost, long-limbed and very thin. He ran with the reeling stride of desperate exhaustion, his copper-skinned face suffused with blood, his breath rasping in his throat. He dived into a gap between the houses, stopped short with a despairing flutter as he saw the stone wall of the citadel blocking the alley's end, and turned to flee. Then he sprang back in fright as a wave of yelling men with torches poured in upon him, blocking his escape. In an instant he was overwhelmed, kicked, and beaten to the ground. The horrified watchers saw a rope slung over the grill of a window in the wall below. Struggling and screaming, the helpless youth was being dragged over to it. Ills cursed, turned to the stairs, but stopped. The street was 4 circuitous floors below. By the time they got there, even with weapons, the victim would be past help. Elof looked around desperately. Many of the heavy roof tiles of glazed earthenware were missing. Others looked loose. He seized one, and it came away in his hand. Wolfish, baying laughter arose. One of the mob was about to drop the noose round the boy's neck, others to throw their weight on the rope. Elof poised the tile and threw. The sureness of his aim startled even him. With a loud smacking sound, the tile took the noose man on the side of the head and stretched him flat on the ground. "Good!" yelled Ilse. An instant later, her tile clipped the arm of the first man on the rope, and he fell down screaming among its coils. The other rioters looked up with angry shouts, but dropped back in alarm, guarding their heads from a lethally accurate shower of tiles. Then, from the street sounded fast hoofbeats, horn calls, shouts, and suddenly a tall man on a great white warhorse plunged in among the rioters, calling orders in a clarion voice. A sword was at his side, but he laid about him with a huge drover's whip, his bronzen hair flying, and screams arose from the crowd as it milled this way and that to escape hoof and lash. Behind him streamed men in the armor of the city guard, and they fell upon the rioters, striking about with their pike shafts. Before the pikes, the mob's killing mood changed at once to panic. They dropped their victim, boiled about, and scattered, tripping over him in their hurry to escape, and horsemen and guards wheeled off to break and disperse them. Elof breathed his relief, only to see a straggler suddenly turn back, stoop over the sprawling youth, and with brutal precision thrust a long knife through his stomach. Elof's last throw caught the slayer only a glancing blow to the thigh, and with a savage gesture he hobbled off. Before Elof could react, the horseman came cantering back through the melee, but the youth's writhings had stilled. At the rider's word, a pair of guards ran up. One bent over the bodies of hangman and victim, looked up to the rider, and shook his head. By the time they had made their way downstairs, Kermorven was already in the courtyard, leading his horse to the stable and calling loudly for breakfast. "I don't have such an appetite," said Elof grimly, as he followed the warrior into the cool gloom of the lesser hall, where a wizened old servant was setting out a few plain dishes. "Not now." Ilse, who had herself cut down men without the least qualm, nodded agreement. You should keep your strength up, said Kermorven dryly, tearing at the loaf of hot cornbread before him. After tossing half my ancestral roof into the street, you must be exhausted. He washed the bread down with a swallow of strong cider and smiled, more sympathetically. I know, it was the only thing to be done. But jesting apart, spare the roof if you can. Those tiles are old and costly to replace. As for the boy, you did right to fell those roughs, but console yourself. It was a kind of justice nonetheless. It was that lad and 2 others who set on and robbed a shopkeeper earlier this morning. An old man who may well die. Almost overhead, on the high seaward towers of the citadel, ringing trumpets mirrored the sunrise in their tone, signaling the beginning of the city's day. Elof rubbed his stubbled chin. So? When it could only stir up more trouble between city and northerners? Another riot? Are you sure? We took one of his accomplices, and he confessed. They were starving, he said, and I believe him. Skin and bones that he is. But they also thought to avenge that northerner who was robbed on the outskirts last week. Avenge? 12 more that I know of have died in the uproar this morning, 10 of them northerners. By now it may be more. Do you wonder I insist these things are stamped out the moment they begin, and thoroughly? There is no end to them. They breed. Aye, but have a care, said Ilse darkly. You're brewing trouble for yourself, making yourself unpopular with the rabble. Ask Rock. Ask Ferhas. They hear the gossip, and it's that you're too soft on the northerners. They were herding that one here to string him up on your window. A little love gift, since you like them so much. And you're still only Marchwarden-elect. You've not the full powers yet. Till noon today only. And have I not been given every encouragement to use the rightful powers of office to the hilt and past this last half-year? That's not what Brihon and his bullies will be shouting, said Elof. Kermorven shrugged. If others will not act speedily enough, I must. Brihon or no Brihon. There have been riots enough, with or without provocation. Elof, the first came in midwinter, while you yet lay ill. Then we thought it was a passing folly, a brief outburst at the inflow of northern fugitives, when we were ourselves in need. Kermorven shrugged. Now we know better. Every day it grows worse, and every day more come, as the Ekwesh rampage through Norderney. The common folk fear. They cannot believe our land will feed them all. I begin to wonder myself. And so fear breeds hatred in both sides, and hatred leads to crimes, crime to riot. And to madness all, snorted Ilse, tossing her thick black curls. You men are all daft, to wish such miseries upon your fellows, and to suffer them so lightly. Look at us. Did we not come, we 3, through danger upon danger to succor your folk? And what thanks do we find? Oh, you, Kermorven, you they laud and applaud, or most of them anyhow. You they make Marchwarden, and well they might. But us? Even your own precious faction point the finger at Elof as some kind of northern warlock. Benign enough, but maybe not to be trusted. And me they call his familiar. I can hardly walk abroad by myself. And that's your friends. What your enemies say? That moonstruck Brihon and his rabble? But that's mere malice, protested Elof. It's so obvious Brihon seeks only to settle an old score. Surely, few save his own close faction believe. More than you think, said Ilse sharply. Her dark eyes flashed. They don't want to believe they were so short a step from defeat, nor that they had to be rescued by foreigners. There's more like them every day. Well, I have had enough. I go, and soon. Back to the Hollow Hills, and this city may slide into the sea for all I care. The men sprang up, protesting, but Ilse sat back, face set and stubborn. Waste no more words. I endured this long only to see Elof made well, and the success of my healing. Her round fingers knitted together a moment. He needs me no longer. My mind is made up. Grimorvan sighed. And you, Elof, what will you do now you are well? I hope you at least do not wish to depart. My house is yours for as long as you wish it, and the city folk do respect you. With your fair skin, they forget you were a northerner. Will I? Grimorvan flushed in embarrassment. Do not take it so. I meant only that you may help overcome their foolish distrust of northerners. Remember, the first copperskins most have seen were on Ekwesh, and your folk look much like the Reavers. Too much, in eyes that saw the horrors of the siege. But if you and I can open those eyes to the old kinship, there is a chance. Elof shook his head. I'm sorry. Oh, it's true enough what you say, but no. My prime purpose, my heaviest duty, ended when that evil I unleashed was undone. Another promise claims me now. There's another place I must go. Grimorvan frowned. What place? I don't know. Elof looked out into the courtyard, to where the first long rays of the sunrise warmed the courtyard's cold paving. I know only whither it lies. That way, in the path of the dawn, whither I must go, to wander, to roam across the whole wide world if I must. I do not wish to tarry long. I dare not. Grimorvan nodded. I understand. But you will stay at least for today? And you, Ilse? At least come to the ceremony, both of you, ere you settle your minds to any of this. There you may hear something to make you think. I doubt that, muttered Ilse. She'll come, grinned Elof. She wouldn't miss it for the world, any more than I. Will it be you saying all these things? Grimorvan stood up, rubbing at his stiff back. I appreciate the honor of my position less during early alarms. Yes, some of them at least. He sucked in a long, determined breath, and his face hardened. I mean to make myself heard. The syndics have been dragging their heels over this matter of the northern refugees. We must settle it, secure their safety, and quickly, at whatever cost. Then his grimness faded to a smile. Linger over your food as you wish, but I must be at the syndicacy well in advance. Pharos, my robes. Come, I beg you, both of you. For if this day goes as I think it may, I shall have need of my friends. He strode away from the table and up the wide main stairs, scabbard slapping at his riding boot as if to punctuate his shouts for his squire. Elof gazed around the gloomy hall, following the peeled and faded murals, the portraits darkened by centuries of smoke from the hanging lamps. He values us, you know, he said. Admirers he has now, aye, and flatterers in plenty. No family at all. I know, said Ills, and sniffed disapprovingly. A poor place to grow up in, this, with only a few old women to look after him, and his father's squire for a tutor. Wonder he did not turn out odder than he is. Think he has few friends as close as we, said Elof. And this ceremony must mean a lot to him. Will you not witness that, at least? Then you can tell your folk that they have one friend among our rulers, mad and savage though we be. We? Never number yourself among these folk, nor among your precious northerners, retorted Ills. You're another breed entirely. Whatever blood flows in your veins, and him also. He is wise to grab hold of his marchwarden's place while he may, hard and thankless honor though it is. The tide of gratitude that swept him into it neglected to provide wealth to patch even his own roof, let alone sustain the people's. In these parts, it seems gratitude's a beggar child, starved into an early grave. What will be left of it after he puts down a few more riots? It'll be back to what drove him out in the first place. His partisans and brehons breaking each other's heads in the streets, and the ordinary citizens damning them both. Fairhouse says there are whispers even among his friends. Only this time, there's the Ekwesh waiting to sweep up the bits. Well, since you insist on going to the ceremony, so will I also, for all my heart counsels otherwise. I fear, Elof, I fear. You? What could you fear? Anything. Nothing. This great warren of men oppresses me. It dims my wits as the sun does my eyes. I start at shadows, that's all. She tossed a hunk of bread onto his plate. Eat, and pay no heed. But as they emerged into the sunny street an hour or so later, Elof could well understand her feelings. The bustle and roar of Kerbrahine, the great city, swept at him and over him like an inrushing wave, carrying with it the sound and scent of men a millionfold. From the cliff-like crag of the citadel overhead to the first low slopes of the hazy hills around, all, everywhere, was a great sea of men, walls and houses rising above it like summits of coral along a reef, and writhing coils of smoke. Vast and stately as were the works of the Duergar, they stood quieter, emptier by comparison. There was no such sense of fierce vitality barely pent, nor of such bitter unease. Yet he understood it little better than Ills, and what aroused her contempt awoke in him a measure of pity. The city folk had been terribly shaken, first by the sudden and devastating assault when they had thought themselves so rich and invulnerable, and then by the vast inpouring of northerners fleeing the Ekwesh. The people had looked to their lords for some wise word, some simple gesture that would turn time back to the days of their smug security. But now they were growing impatient, beginning to suspect what might well be true, that there was no such word or gesture, that there was no going back, ever, to what had been. In such a time it was easy to seek scapegoats. They had heard Kermorven cheered to the echo as he left the house, but now Elof saw heads turn in the crowded street. He heard, or guessed at, the dark mutterings, ribald whispers, sniffs of sternly self-righteous disapproval, sensed fingers pointing in stabbing gestures of distrust and fear. By popular prejudice, Duergar were regarded as vermin, on a level with beasts of the gutter, and he as some kind of necromancer for walking with one. He swung aside the bag of tools that he was taking to finish some work for Rock, and took her arm. It was tense against his side. Nowhere among all this, not even behind the walls they had just quitted, could she feel even remotely secure. Fortunately, the way to the Syndicacy was not long. Glenmorven's ancestral roof, dilapidated as it was, stood tall among the houses of the old city, against the rocky crags of the citadel's northern flank. Before its gentler eastward face, there opened a wide quadrangle, all paved with white stone, the square of the citadel, and along one whole side of that ranged the massive gray frontage of the Syndicacy. High though it stood, it was outwardly stark and plain, its only ornament a line of austere pillars which ran out around the great main doors to support a lofty canopied porch towering on steps above the heads of the throng in the square. Ilse flinched nervously at the noisy crush around the steps, but strode beside Elof as if she had no troubles in the world. The crowd parted swiftly to let them pass, as if fearing the contact, and she smiled sardonically. Even vermin have their privileges, I see. When they entered the portico, the Syndicacy's air of austerity vanished, for all around its inner walls were rich mosaics, male and female figures depicted in swirls of vibrant color. Elof guessed by their size and their heroic aspect and distinctive attributes that they must represent the powers most revered by the people of Bryhane. There was Nyrad with his nets, succoring mariners, and Ilmarinen, as it seemed, releasing lava to shape the citadel rock, and many others he did not know. He looked in vain for a figure in black armor or blue mantle, till Ilse pointed to the summit of the great doors ahead. Above their wide arch rose a great sun in gold, pouring down gilt radiance, and across its disk, flying with the open beak, a vast raven. To Ilmarinen, Ilse bowed as they passed, but at the raven, Elof glared. The doors beneath were blackened wood, of great height and thickness, and width enough to span almost the whole floor of the chamber within. At most times they stood shut tight, shielding the deliberations of the Syndicacy from common eyes. But upon rare days such as this, they were flung wide to vouchsafe the crowd a glimpse of its solemn ceremonial. Fairhas, Glenmorven's squire and steward, awaited them there, white mane bobbing nervously. He ushered them swiftly up a marble stair to places kept for them at the front of the crowded public gallery, overlooking both chamber and doors, but himself chose to stand some way behind. Elof smiled wryly. Even wise old Fairhas was as much a city man as the worthies on either side who edged discreetly away. Much as he valued these proven friends of his master's, he had long held the city view of northerners as bumpkins at best, at worst barbarians, and still less could he shake off the violent prejudice against Duergar. The conflict left him perpetually ill at ease in their presence. It was chiefly more traveled men, Northland traders such as Cathel Cetahin, who held broader views. There were not so many of these in the city now, and among the 400-odd syndics, fewer than a score. And even of those, how many could Glenmorven rely upon to side with the refugees, if the majority would not? Elof scanned the wide, empty chamber below, the banked rows of seats carved from fine stone and gilded wood, set about with signs and blazons where the places was held by ancestral right as well as wealth. The many-colored windows flecked the chamber with glowing warmth. All in all, a noble sight, yet to his eyes it looked cold and hard, entrenched, unyielding. So also too many of the syndics seemed as they filed in, proud in the sweeping splendor of their robes. Too many faces reminded him of the headmen and elders of Assenby. Strong and even capable men those had been, but blind to all of the world that did not concern their immediate interests. So also these seemed, and from all he had heard, in defense of those interests, they could be selfish and quarrelsome as children. Green robes marked the landowners and men of property, gray the scholars and officials, brown the merchants and tradesmen, but they varied wildly in shade and pattern and ornament, sometimes as a mark of faction, more often as a display of wealth. The two great factions, once nobles and commoners, now old nobility against new, generally wore darker or lighter shades of their particular color, but still they vied in ornament. Some of the gray robes were most richly and garishly adorned of all, while many of the scarlet robes of the warrior order, worn over armor and the weapons they alone might bear in the assembly, seemed positively old and threadbare. Not so one that was borne by a dark man of great height, taller even than Kermorven. Light red it was, and marked at the breast with the device of a claw and broken chain. Its discreet border of worked gold and baldric of golden mail bore out his air of prosperous ease, as did the smooth joviality with which, pausing by the doors, he acknowledged the loud acclaim of a good part of the crowd. At last, men of the city guard called for silence, and a wide door at the rear boomed open. Syndics and spectators alike rose to their feet, and the crowd surged forward to see. In came the two elderly marshals of the city in gray robes, their faces uneasy, and behind them in scarlet and armor the wardens of the eastern and southern marches, flanking Kermorven as warden-elect of the north. But at sight of him, a swelling cheer from without faltered and dwindled to a great babble of astonishment. For the robes he wore were not scarlet, but black, trimmed and collared with heavy gold, and over his heart, in gold, was traced the emblem of the raven and sun. The guardsmen hammered their staves on the marble floor for silence, as the procession swept towards the center of the assembly, leading Kermorven to a tall seat one place to the right of the marshal's chairs. But ere they could reach it, there was a rustle of robes, and the dark man was on his feet, his gangling frame towering over the marshals and blocking their path. "One moment," he cried, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "One moment, my lords. By what authority do you admit this man to the syndicacy and lead him to a place? And by what authority is he permitted to bear those robes?" The astonished marshals gaped at him. Well, through chamber and square alike, a buzz of dispute arose. Many of the crowd, and even some in the gallery, howled abuse at the tall man, till across the floor another man rose, in brown robes trimmed with fine furs that only emphasized his stoutness, and his rich, mellow voice rode over the uproar. "By the unopposed vote of this assembly under the rule of war, these 6 months past, that would be how, my Lord Rohan, and in recognition and reward for great deeds done, which is more than I recall you were ever voted." "And those remarkable robes, my Lord Cathel?" As to them..." The merchant's voice was honeyed as ever, but it had lost some of its first certainty. "Well, they are of his choosing, and I know of no law that prevents him." Kermorven raised his hand calmly. "My lords marshal, they are the robes my great-grandfather last wore in this assembly, as was the ancient and unquestioned privilege of our line. By what authority has that been changed? And by what authority are these questions asked? By the need to question a decision forced through in haste and folly, said Brihon with equal calm. And consequently, perhaps, to impose some grave penalty. Sharp whispers, astonished and aghast, ran across the chamber, echoes rustling like dead leaves in the domed roof. And outside, the crowd rumbled contention and discontent. But he has not yet taken his seat in the assembly, blustered the leading marshal, a stout, red-faced old man with bristling white mustaches. His blue-gray eyes were not penetrating like Kermorvan's, but bulging and opaque. Looks like a dead fish, muttered Ills, only with fewer wits. Let him stand, then, said Brihon quietly, as must all brought here to our judgment. A wild chorus of dispute broke out, and Elof could hear that neither in chamber nor in crowd was at all on Kermorvan's side. Scuffles were breaking out, and files of guardsmen went hurrying down to deal with them ere they spread. The harassed marshal conferred with his colleague, a younger edition of himself. They shook their heads at Brihon and Kermorvan alike, and when the guards had eventually enforced silence, they announced that all should take their seats for now, but without ceremonial, and Brihon should have the right to speak. He smiled and bowed graciously, and stepped to the middle of the floor. My lords marshal, fellow syndics, for any discourtesy I crave your pardon. But it seems to me that the only way to forestall what might not easily be undone. Master Cathel, in justifying this strange act of the syndicacy, you mentioned the matter of some great deeds done by this man. But the people of this city are driven to ask, were such deeds ever done? What foolishness is this? Stammered the marshal into a shocked silence. Yours, I fear, said the dark man coolly. He rounded on the other syndics. What do these deeds amount to? A skillful claim, aided, it shames me to say, by some within this city, to have compassed the defeat of that whole savage army which besieged us. How? He shook his head in apparent wonder. By the slaying of one of their leaders, and by the shattering of some savage totem, which he claims they relied upon. But I ask you, look again without panic and credulity at the events of that sorry time. That we were beaten back by the first attacks, that is little wonder, for they came upon us without the least warning, and we a people at peace, unprepared. But given a day or so to muster our full force, to plan our strategy, we sallied out and we drove them back into the sea, as you would expect. For how could such savages stand against the forces of this city? Ask of yourselves, must we really hare after miracles to explain their defeat? Are we ourselves grown so savage? Are we sunk to the level of simple northerners that believe in magical mutterings over metal? His cool eyes swept the chamber with mild scorn. It seems we are. For from a sideline of the battle, a man stages a clever show with the corpse of a slain chieftain and a broken weapon. Were there not enough of both that day? and with some small encouragement, we fall at his feet. Some encouragement, no doubt, from those who would gladly turn aside the people's allegiance, that they might have been more easily be oppressed. Turn it aside from their chosen leaders, from us. The word was spoken no less quietly, but with the spitting intensity of water on hot steel. Elof sat silent, held in icy thrall by the pattern of what was unfolded before him. It was shaped with cunning to appeal to all that was narrowest and most insular in the southern temperament, and the typical syndic most of all. They would know, if they remembered truly, that events had not been as Brihon described them. For one thing, where had the lightning come from that blasted their walls? But he was presenting them with every inducement to disbelieve and distort their own memories, even an open appeal to their naked self-interest, a hint that Kermorven threatened their power. As if scenting success, the tall man's manner grew more jovial. He grinned and fingered his bushy beard. After all, why should we believe such a man, whom we knew even in his first youth as a vicious, brawling braggart? Was this assembly not on the point of trying and exiling him, save that he slunk away in disgrace, to avoid a formal sentence and the seizure of his property, such as he has? And what did we hear of him then? Tales that he had taken up with a pack of starveling corsairs, and then vanished from their ken, until 2 years later he reappears amid a sudden onslaught of savages, an onslaught he had been threatening us with for warning, said Kermorven, equally quietly, yet so unexpectedly that all started. Warning, not threatening. Brihon inclined his head. As you will. It mends nothing. Warning us, then, for years in an attempt to spread a panic that would bring him power. As in the end, it seems, it so conveniently has. The change in his voice was startling, so loud now that it overbore the first cries of protest. These brown-skinned reavers took us by surprise. That is true. But have you not, any of you, asked yourselves how such a thing might come to pass? How a pack of sea-roving savages could dare assault, let alone manage to breach, the walls of the greatest city in this land? How else? Brihon answered himself simply, save by treason. And he looked from Kermorven up the gallery straight at Ills and Elof. Elof felt his ears and face flame hot, as if he bent over a forge fire. He sprang to his feet at the gallery rail and shouted, And do you call me a traitor? What manner of man, then, skulks on city walls at dead of night? What manner of man tries to murder those he meets there in secret, though all they ask is to be brought before authority? And there's witnesses enough for that. The crowd seemed to snarl like a slide of falling rock. Kermorven flashed him a sudden warning glance. Ills plucked him down by the sleeve. Brihon did not so much as look at him. His voice was calm and smooth as the stuff of his robe. Which brings us to the manner of this singular return. Did he come openly and in brotherhood, offering to take his place among us as equal? He did not. At dead of night he came slinking over an embattled wall, and he came in strange company. a northern vagrant, the first of many, and though one would hardly credit it, a creature of the mountains, a race accounted as savage as the man-eaters and still more beast-like. A rush of memories awoke in Elof, of halls rich and noble in the hollow hills, clam rivers mirrored dark under stone, strong faces lined with lifetimes of wisdom and great craft, of a folk who had succored a desperate unknown in flight from his own destiny, and set the power in his hands to forge it anew. He was ready to spring down, to spit his contempt in Brihon's face, and dash his fist after. But to his surprise, Ilse at his side remained calm, though her heavy brows were drawn tight. "Be still," she hissed, and he remembered suddenly how much older than him she must be. "We are but ciphers here, conceits in a debate, no more. It's not for us to answer, but Kermorven. Then may he do so soon." Brihon gestured at Kermorven. "What do you think the ancestors he vaunts before us would have made of him then? Much what I did, I fear. And if in the days since that return he had proved me wrong, with all my heart I would have made amends, and been the first to follow him today. But has he? What has he brought us since? Help and wisdom in our need? Hardly. Instead, he has encouraged a flock of carrion crows to settle upon our already devastated fields, under guise of a kinship long forsworn. His pack? For do they not hang upon his every word? And how many more of them are there to come, when the northern marches are in his hands? Shall the Northlands be emptied for us to feed? See how the half-savages he shields steal among you, the northerners who scuttle southward from their cannibal kin. See how they slip the very bread from before the mouths of your hungry children, the smallest wealth from your pocket, the roof from over your heads. A strange way to treat a city he professes to care for. Either he is mad, or he has a purpose. And what can that purpose be?" He waved a hand in Kermorven's general direction. "I am grateful to him in his arrogance, for so vast was his pride in what he thought his hour of triumph, that he has saved me the labor of convincing you. For he stands revealed in his purpose. Is he not clad in its colors?" Elof could not guess what he meant, but the barb struck harder upon the city folk than any gone before. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then a roar like a great wave breaking. Elof could hear cries both for Brihon and against him, for Kermorven and against him also. But it was as if the same feeling fed them, a ravening anger that seemed to convulse both crowd and chamber, syndics and spectators both, as a lightning flare leaps from cloud to cloud. Blows flew freely among the crowd. Brawls sprang up and spread outward like ripples in a pond. Anger rode upon the shoulders of the crowd, anger whose very cause and moment seemed forgotten in its own mad onrush. It was like a wave indeed, driven on from behind by shouts and milling brawls. The great crowd surged forward, up the steps, and spilled through the doors into the syndicacy itself. Elof shuddered as he heard the rising growl of that most savage and monstrous of beasts, a mob. Syndics sprang to their feet in fury and alarm, but their shouts went unheard in the row. His formerly stolid neighbors in the gallery were on their feet also, shouting first down into the chamber, and then at each other and others around. Feet clattered on the stairs, and a tide of riders spilled into the gallery. "Mad!" shouted Ilse, ducking down as blows were traded above her head and Elof's. "Stark mad! The whole pack of—" Then a heap of struggling, cursing bodies tumbled between them, and they were forced apart. To either side of Elof the spectators scattered in panic, stumbling over the stairs and each other, and he saw one almost toppled over the low stone balustrade. "Ilse!" he shouted, and heard a faint voice cry out, "Elof, beware! At your back!" He whirled and saw a knot of tall men forcing their way determinedly through the crush in his direction. 5 copper-skinned northerners, all with faces hard and fell. They saw him, even as he them, and plunged down on him. He saw steel glint among their garments, and his hand flew to his side for the sword that was not there. He cursed, seized the heavy bench he had been sitting on, and with a heave tore it free as the first knife reached out for him. It stuck in the wood, and he upended the heavy seat and smashed it down upon the wielder's head. Another threw his weight upon the bench and tore it from his hand, and the rest sprang forward. Elof looked desperately for some weapon, saw at his feet his tool-pack spilled open, and seized the huge hammer with which he had forged the sword. Short in the haft it was, but terrible weight was in its high-peaked head, as long as his forearm, and cored with strange and turbulent metals of great weight, which the Duergar alone knew how to refine and contain in safety. Swiftly he straightened, and with wild strength he swung it against the nearest blade. There was a sharp, shattering ring, and the long knife splintered against its wielder's hand. Icy pain lanced into his side. He felt a blade snag in his jerkin, fell back, and struck out once again. With a frightful, muffled sound, the hammer struck deep into flesh, and the man fell choking and writhing to the floor. Another loomed over him with upraised hand, in it no knife, but a short sword. Elof's arm was seized from behind, and the crook of an elbow snaked around his throat. Then it was suddenly torn free, as if someone had hurled the man away. With no room to swing the hammer, he drove it straight into the swordsman's stomach. The man doubled, and it was Elof's hand that rose and fell. Once. The cry came again. He sprang round and saw Ilse by the balustrade, struggling half-choked in the grip of the remaining 2 killers, who were striving to force her over it. So it was she who had freed him. From the chamber below came the ring and clash of swords, but he paid that no heed and barged through the crowds towards her. The killers saw him, pulled her back from the balustrade, but instead set her before them as a shield and charged up the gallery steps towards the door. Without stopping to think, Elof whirled his arm and let the hammer fly, as he had the tile. A handspan above Ilse's dark hair it flew, and one man yelled in horror as the other's head was dashed into a spraying pulp. Ilse's arm was free, and even as Elof sprang and shouldered his way through, she caught her attacker by the throat and hurled him to the ground. He sprang up, snake-lithe, unfolding a clasp knife from his sleeve, but Ilse seized his arms. The knife slashed past her throat. She heaved, and her Duergar strength told. The man cartwheeled down the steps, struck the balustrade, and slid, screaming and scrabbling, over its brink. Elof stood gasping, staring. How many attackers had there been? Then they saw the man whose sword and hand he had shattered run for the door, holding off old Fairhouse with a knife. He had all but reached the stairs when there came a clatter of arms beyond. He sought to spring back, but a robed silhouette blocked the opening. With horrific suddenness, a bright sword leaped out between the man's shoulder blades. Then a mass of guards poured through, and set about subduing the rioters and herding them toward the stairs. Elof looked at the dead attacker, and at the red-robed man who had run him through, now stooping to wipe his sword on his victim's jerkin. The newcomer glanced up and raised an eyebrow. "Brawling again, Sir Smith? And in the syndicacy, too. No tiles here. Be warned by the fate of this one. But it appears that you took some small hurt. We shall call that lesson enough." Elof looked down. Only when he saw the bloodstain in his side did he remember the sting and feel it anew. Scratch, no more. And glad as I am to see you quelling disorder for once, Brihon, you were not quite timely enough. As before, we had to do most of the work ourselves. Red flame burned in the dark man's cheeks. "Fitting enough," he shrugged, and kicked at the copper-hued arm. "Northerner slay Northerner. Your friend put paid to another 2 brace on the chamber floor. Perhaps he is learning wisdom. Guards, remove this carrion." "Northerners," muttered Elof, following the guards who were dragging the corpses away down the stairs. "I wonder. I grew up among them, remember? These have brown skins, yes. But look at the hard faces on them, and the scarring. Do they not sooner resemble—" "Amicac's guts, yes!" roared Cathel, stumping over to the door with Kermorvan at his heels. "Ekwesh, and the ones down here also. Where in Hela's name did they spring from?" "Stragglers from their foraging bands, perhaps," said Kermorvan thoughtfully. "Left behind in the rout, slipping into the city in the guise of refugees to seek revenge. Seeing their chance in the disorder caused by Lord Brihon's unruly followers. But there is another, darker chance. They could be spies, assassins, deliberately sent among the refugees from the Ekwesh settlements in the north. In which case—" "We cannot afford to admit any of them," broke in Brihon. "It seems you learn wisdom indeed." "You mistake me, Brihon. It proves my point, not yours." "And what point is that?" "You will hear when the session begins anew, and the sooner you call your mob to heel, the sooner that will be. I suggest you set about it." A mirthless grin gleamed in Brihon's thick beard. "I have not yet had my full say. But better, perhaps, that you stand convicted out of your own mouth. Speak on, then." "Well, you make progress," croaked Ilse to Elof as they climbed wearily back up to the gallery. "Brihon speaks to you instead of at you. Wonders will never cease. Speaking of which, I wonder you dealt with that one behind you. I strove to help, but I was already half-throttled." "But you did help," said Elof, gathering up his trampled tools from the gallery floor. "He was pulled away." She shook her head firmly. "Not by me. He only turned to me after you threw him off." "Who, then?" But Ilse only shrugged. "Perhaps he slipped." She avoided the bloodied end of the bench as she sat. Elof shook his head. "Cannot explain it. They were certainly assassins. They knew their targets. What will Kermorven have to say about that? The chamber and the crowd alike were hushed as Kermorven stepped out to speak. He looked at them a moment, then at Brihon, and his gaze grew very cold. His words rang clear against the marble of the chamber. Syndics and people of Kerbrahine, this day you have heard my lord of Brihuren lay many grave charges against me. Or have you? I know this man of old, and I took care to listen to his actual words, not the dark things he implied. For the most part, he simply struck a spark with subtly worded questions, and led your minds to blow them to a blaze. For well he knows that such cloudy and insubstantial matters are harder to dispel with solid truth. But truth is the best I have to offer you, and I warn you now, it will not be the truth you wish to hear. Yet it will avail nothing to riot or shout me down, for truth is truth, and if you stopped my voice forever, it would not alter by one jot the forces I see at work, save perhaps to hasten them. He looked at Brihon scornfully. I have ample answers for the trifling charges this man made, but I will content myself with an example or two only for now. Take the matter of the Corsairs. I joined them only because they were willing to fight the Akwesh, when all others in this land laughed at the idea that they could be a threat, or choose to believe Lord Brihon's insinuations at that time, which were that I sought to win military power for myself by building up a false menace. Those Corsairs are in this city now, having won pardon, and we have testimony enough that they fought the Akwesh, and valiantly. Brihon inclined his head mockingly. I bow to your authority. They fought, aye, for booty already riven from our folk. Elof bit his lip. That was sadly true, though not as it was put. But Kermorven was undaunted. Did I say it was not so? Yet I thought that better, much better, than nothing, for even such small opposition might discourage the reavers from the Southlands long enough for this city to see its peril, and I could at least put the wealth gained thereby to building up a fleet. A small hope, and as I eventually realized, a false one. When I heard of a matter more urgent, the mysterious mind sword, I turned to that instead. For another example, take the manner of my return. How in the world could I have returned openly, as Brihon suggests, to a city besieged and partly taken? What other way was there but quietly and in darkness, when it could not be said for certain who held which part of the wall? The suggestion is absurd, as Brihon must know. Yet see how he used it to color the gravest charge of all he dares to bring against me. Trouble passed over Kermorven's lean features like a cloud, and his voice was stern and bleak as a cold wind from the north. He has deftly avoided making the charge openly, but through his words I stand accused, in sum, of having sought by some means or another to use the events of the siege to seize power within the city, to set myself up as ruler, as tyrant over you all, as your king. Elof's first instinct was to laugh, but the deadly stillness quelled it. The crowd hardly seemed to be breathing. This was something they took with deadly seriousness. And looking at Kermorven, he saw that his friend did also. A great hush filled chamber and gallery alike, and the silence seemed itself a clarion, calling from the deeps of time. Kermorven lifted his head, and there was a fierce smile on his lips, a grim pride in his voice. "But why should you believe this? The child of kings I acknowledge myself, but this was never their kingdom." Elof blinked as if he had been struck, hardly aware of the uproar that washed over him. "I saw before Andvar that he must be some great noble," he murmured to Ilse. "But a king? Of where?" "But did you not know?" hissed Fairhoss in his ear, detachment forgotten in the excitement. "His name. Doesn't the glory shine out of that, all alive? You in the north, sir, have you quite forgotten them? The lost lands in their great city of olden times? Greatest there's ever been in this land?" "Yes, the Strandenberg he called it. City by the waters. But his name? He called himself plain Kermorven then." "Ah," breathed Fairhouse, "and he stuck to your northern tongue. That'd be when he wasn't right sure of you, if you'll pardon my saying, sir," he added hastily, with a furtive, superstitious gesture. "But you've seen the southern well, sir. Can't you see now? Caher, or Care. That's a walled city like this. More, a great lake or sea. And more Ohen. That's the water strand. So Caher, more Ohen. Kermorven. That was the city's name, sir, and so of his kingly line, what remains of it. The name alone's not uncommon, for there are younger branches that bear it. But Karen, now, that's one of the kingly names, for firstborn of the true line only. Put the two together, and he'd have been telling you who he was at once. It was among the corsairs you met him, wasn't it, sir? And them Southrons. He'd not risk naming himself clear in that company. 'Twasn't you he distrusted, sir. 'Twas them." Ilse was nodding slowly to herself, as if at a suspicion now confirmed. But Elof stared down at his friend as if he had never truly seen him before. Kings were hardly human to him, benign or frightening figures in childhood tales, remote figures of worship and majesty or wicked tyranny. This lean, young fighter he had first met barefoot upon a beach, rubbing shoulders with a hard-bitten corsair crew, hardly seemed to fit either image. Yet even as Elof formed the thought, that mantle of infinite age seemed to settle about the tall young warrior once again, as it had in the courts of the Duergar before Andvar, their lord, and it diminished even his grim presence. Kermorven, his face mild and calm once more, advanced to the center of the floor, and the light from the windows gleamed in his thick bronze hair, so that he looked in truth a king already crowned. "It may be, though, that you will not believe what I say. Or, more subtly, you fear that the enmity of Lord Brihon and his friends will force me to fight for the dominion of Kerbrahine, whether I will or no, and so plunge the state into civil war. That indeed might come to pass." He raised a hand to quell the swelling protests, and repeated more loudly, "Might come to pass, if Rohan forced me to it. And if I thought such dominion worth the winning, but I do not. Never for good or ill would I seize their rule. Why? Because though I dearly love this realm, these lands in which I was born, I believe that the days of their greatness are ended, that even the time of their enduring draws to a close. As well sees a sandhill around which the tide is washing. For I truly believe that this city is doomed. I believe that the downfall of Kerbrahine is at hand. The sense of shocked disbelief was so tangible in the chamber, Elof almost expected laughter. But it was a cry of fear, as much as anger, that arose from the crowd outside and wiped any laughter from the faces of the syndics. Then Rohan sprang up and rounded upon the crowd.
Pay no heed to the man. Is not his purpose clear? He seeks to fright you like children with shadows, to scare you, that you may come clinging to his skirts.
Now, indeed, cries of anger arose, as rumor of Kermorvan's words and Rohan's were tossed and bandied about. No doubt, with exaggerations, among those too far back to hear. Again the growl of the beast awakened, but even as it did so, Kermorvan strode to the door, and his commanding cry echoed across the square.
Be still! Be still and hear!
And astonishingly, the crowd indeed fell silent. Kermorvan rounded on the syndics and pressed home his words as a fighter feeling his enemy's guard falter.
The Ekwesh, they are our doom. They have seen our walls breached, our strength falter before theirs. They have tasted blood. They have tasted wealth, and worse, they have tasted defeat and flight. That, at least, will unite them, now that the fell sword cannot. They will return, and soon, before the eldest who fled is too old to fight, and redeem his honor in his clan, and before our scars can heal. At best, in 10 years. At worst, in 1. And how then shall we sustain such another siege? In 10 years, if we have them, the city may build new walls, new ships, new houses. But how can it regain its sons?
The weariness in his voice now was more moving than any trick of oratory.
We were unprepared. The blame for that is not our present matter. But as well as fighting men, to the tally of our slain is added women and children. Within these walls more than 1/5 of both perished, and the country folk, being first set upon, fared worse. Let us ponder on that, we confident syndics. As our folk grow old and die in their turn, who shall replace them? What does it mean for our numbers?
The assembly stirred in deep disquiet, but no word was spoken, not even by Rohan. The dark man looked baffled a moment, then sat up sharply, as if seeing Kermorvan's intent, and looked as worried as the rest. Kermorvan nodded. You see, our wound festers and worsens. Our numbers will dwindle further. For my part, as warden of the northern marches, I would be fortunate in years to come to raise half the levies the last march warden had, and he and they were slaughtered out of hand. He rounded furiously upon his audience. By Karis Gate, need you wonder why I welcome the fugitives from Norderney?
I would do so even without the demands of mercy and the bonds of kinship. But those bonds exist. Look!"
He gestured up at the gallery. Elof glanced round to see who was meant, and realized it was himself.
"Elof, my northern friend, to whom the true glory of the siege's ending belongs."
Elof, feeling his face redden, smiled sheepishly.
"But he is also a reminder, if you must have it, that Northerners are our kin, as they have been since the founding of Great Caris itself. What if they are chiefly brown-skinned now? What may the skin tell against the man beneath it? They at least had the sense to welcome and succor fugitives when they themselves were weak. Shall we be less wise?"
The rumble from the crowd had little enthusiasm in it, but little anger. Kermorven nodded.
"The Northerners will fight beside us, and heartily, if we have the wit to accept them."
The chamber was silent still, but Elof could feel the change of mood. He became aware that his neighbors were looking at him hesitantly, unsure, almost shamefacedly. But Kermorven did not seem heartened. His voice was, if anything, more sad.
"Think on it, my friends, and be as honest as I have known you. And yet, I fear even that may not be enough." "What will, then?" burst out Brihon. "The placing of a king over us, as our ancestors of old so wisely shunned? Never!"
Other voices echoed him in angry refusal, many syndics among them. Even Cathel and Orens, the other leaders of the merchants, looked anxiously at Kermorven, as they might at a customer who carried the haggling too far. But Kermorven appeared not to notice them. He was staring into the many-colored windows as if into an infinite distance, a gulf of years as well as leagues.
"I mean, Brihon, that we need more folk and a greater vision. We must reunite Northerners and Southrons, Runduyatha and Penruthia, Farhoth and Arothar, that should never have been sundered. But we must not stop there. We must unite all our scattered kin. All."
The syndics looked at each other in puzzlement.
"But who do you mean?" demanded Cathel. "There's only us, those that fled here from the Lost Lands. Us first, and Northerners after. Who else is there?" "That you have forgotten is small blame to you," said Kermorven with a thin smile. "Few in Kerbrahine would remember, for their ancestors fled westward long before the victory of the ice. But others endured longer, until the glaciers were at the very gates of the ancient city itself. Then the king sent many more westward, his queen and infant heir among them, from whom I am descended. Then, as now, there was strife, and many fled northward to settle Norderney. But they recorded that the king had sent others east, to the small ports they had on the coast, as we do on ours. These were not so far from the ice, and very small, but shielded to some degree by mountains. So perhaps their descendants also have survived."
The chamber rumbled with excited comment, and among it some incredulous laughter. "A few, perhaps," chuckled the elder marshal, "but what are they to us? We cannot send them word, let alone summon them." Kermorven's gray eyes glittered. "Why not?" Now indeed there was laughter, and it spilled over into the crowds as Kermorvan's words were repeated.
"Why, man," demanded the other marshal, "have you lost your learning or your wits? Have you forgotten what lies between? The whole span of the land of Bracehall, nigh on 1,000 leagues."
"Aye," shouted Orens the merchant, "and most of the way through the great forest, by all accounts. Such a place that claimed half of those who set out westward."
Yet half were not. Kermorvan threw back at him with a snap. Half, many 1,000, came through. For all they set out ill-prepared and in haste, burdened with families and great store of possessions. And more than half of the northerners came through, though they were even less ready.
"So, indeed," nodded an arid old man in plain grey robes. "But they drew no maps. They were so crazed with fear that they would scarce talk of it again."
"All the more reason that some be drawn," said Kermorvan grimly. "We may be wanderers again, if the Ekwesh return too soon."
"But there's nobody mad enough to set foot in the forest nowadays."
Kermorvan smiled. "I have, though it scared me, and my friends."
He paused to catch a shout from the crowd that others' voices took up.
"What's this? Another?"
"Try Cassie the Hunter,"
bellowed a rough voice from the foreground.
"He's always boasting about it."
"Then let him come forward."
For a moment it seemed he would not be taken up. Then a dark-haired man of middle height was more or less bundled through the throng and up the steps, and stood there sullenly, seemingly ill-pleased at finding himself the center of attention.
"Well, man, what know you of the forest, of Tapayola on Ithan?"
Cassie scowled.
"That you'd best keep that name to yourself beneath the trees, for one. Yes, I've been in it, and often. My master's estate stretched to its very shadow ere the Ekwesh torched it and him, and my father and grandfather before me's hunted there. You learn. There are things to do, things not to do. You watch your step, keep your nerve, and you're well, and the hunting's good."
Kermorvan nodded.
"Well, then, so you at least would brave a journey into it?"
"Well."
Cassie's leathery face twitched, and the crowd laughed. He scowled again.
"Not alone," he barked. "Who would? Not you bastards, for sure."
"You would not be alone," said Kermorvan. "A company would be sent."
"Is this not the idlest folly of all?"
cried Braihan, and awoke clamoring assent from parts of the crowd.
"How do we know there is anyone left alive in the east, or that they are worth the finding? They could have dwindled to nothing by now."
"Or be as free and strong as we should be. I agree. We know nothing. We must find out. We must send a company eastward, scout and assembly both, and without delay."
Braihan threw up his hands.
"Can we in our need spare some such costly mission, let alone the huge warband it would require as escort? Its mere absence would weaken us, let alone its most likely loss. He has told us we bleed, which we knew full well already. Now he seeks to open our wound still further. In pursuit of what?"
He shrugged.
"The shadow of a memory, or something worse?"
"My lord Braihan," sighed Kermorvan, "I conceived of no such great enterprise, apart from your most wise objections. So great a force could not stir a league in those dark lands without drawing the attention of every perilous power, or powers. The emphasis was clear in his voice, and many stirred uneasily and shivered in the noon warmth of the southern sun. A small party we need, of men well hardened to wandering and to peril, yet led by those who can speak for the city, and perhaps also the north.
And do we not have such a man before us?
Demanded Bryon, not bothering to conceal his triumphant smile.
For you must be a most accomplished vagrant by now, and some, I feel, may account your absence welcome, your loss small. As to speaking, you have presumed to do little else this last half hour. So, my Lord Kermorven, I say to you, go, and take with you the discord you have sown in this city. If your idea has one virtue, it is that it would rid us of you. Lead this embassy of death, and I will gladly support it.
Breathing hard, the dark-haired man sprawled back in his seat among the cheers of his followers, grinning with delight at having so entrapped his adversary. Elof clenched his fists, and Ills cursed hoarsely. Kermorven would have to refuse, and so appear to betray his own idea. But the warrior bowed solemnly to his adversary and held the floor.
I thank you once more, Bryon, for saying what I wished said, though somewhat garbled. But I counsel you, do not measure me by the extent of your own ambitions, Bryon. I have no wish to become your king, and nor do I enjoy sowing discord for its own sake, as it seems you do. Never, never will I be the center of bloody strife and division among my own people. Sooner then that I withdraw from among you, as I did before, and seek another way to help you, I will lead our mission eastward.
Both within and without the great chamber, syndic and spectator alike stared in dismay and disbelief. The sight of them, agape like so many fish in a trawl, had Elof chuckling silently to himself. These great folk were as insular as his own villagers, unable to imagine an exile once returned, ever leaving of his own accord. They had known Kermorven's worth well enough, were glad enough to have his valor as their shield, but imagined they could treat him like a mere watchdog, tame him, and chain him, if need be, with the threat of exile. Well, now they knew better. Even some of the syndics who had applauded Bryon most loudly seemed alarmed, glaring openly at the dark man. But Bryon sat stroking his curling beard, his long pale face calm, expressionless, with only the faintest glimmer in his narrow eyes. But my Lord Kermorven, stammered the younger marshal, there was no thought of... We need you. The city needs...
Lad, how can this be wise?
barked Cathel, and then, because he knew his man,
how can it be honorable to toss away your life on such a shallow venture when your city needs you? That way east, it's 100 deaths, plain and fancy. Chance is we'll never see you more. And then, if you're right, I believe you mind, if the Ekwesh do come back, then trust to the Northerners, said Kermorven curtly. That defense I leave you, if only you are honorable in accepting it. And you, Cathel, shall hold the northern marches in my stead. Hearken well, for that is my herald's fee, my price for peace. I exact it as a pledge from all present, you, Bryon, most of all. You shall decree and depose an oath that from tonight
You shall no longer close your gates against the northerners, but treat them with honor and justice. You shall admit them as citizens and equals, subject to the same rights and laws, and you shall allot them land in the country to settle and grow food for themselves and the city. We have it, and to spare, since so many were slain.
But what if they bring more Ekwesh among them?
shrilled a youngish man in ornate green robes.
Now they are on guard. I think you may leave it to the northerners themselves to stop that rat hole,
said Kermorven with grim humor.
Remember, a mere likeness of skin will not deceive them. What better guards could you wish? Enough then. Will you swear, or are you so eaten away by old hatreds that you will see the city fall to slake them?
He spoke to the assembly at large, but his glance fell clearly upon Brihon Briharan. The tall man shrugged and met Kermorven's gaze with a grin.
I'll swear.
He chuckled with jovial contempt.
It may just be worth a few northerners to be rid of you. We might even civilize them in time. I'll even suffer a merchant to be march warden in these upended days. I'll go so far as to wish you success in your venture, scant though I fear the profit will be.
Strange how once Brihon is sworn, the mood of the syndics eases, Elof muttered to Ills, as he heard them take the oath without a word more in dispute. And yet, his followers are no majority. They have been more concerned with avoiding clashes between Kermorven's faction and Brihon's, she whispered back, at any cost, for it might upset their own comfortable lives. Who was right, and what was best for the land? That walked a long way behind. Small wonder the Ekwesh caught them napping. The session lasted only a little longer, time enough to make formal the decree and to install Cathel Ketahan as warden of the northern marches. For all Brihon's jibes, he was a popular choice. From his travels he knew the northern borders better than most, and though not a warrior, he had made a wise commander in the siege. But that he was so easily accepted marked the hold Kermorven had gained upon the syndics.
You see, I learned my lesson well among your folk ills,
he smiled, as he met them on the steps outside.
That one may get what one wants by bending before a wind, as well as standing up to it.
You did well, said Elof soberly. The northerners are deeply in your debt. But the cost to you... Ills nodded fiercely, forgetting her aches. To exile yourself again, and so soon. Did I not say these men were ungrateful? Among my folk you had more honor than this. Kermorven threw back his head and laughed, a rare thing in itself. Then, still chuckling, he rested his forehead against a cool pillar.
And to think one of my ancestors forbade nobles to perform upon the public stage. Do you not see? Why else do you think I maneuvered Brihon into demanding it? This is what I want.
And indeed, he looked happier and more carefree than he had for many a day.
To be no more a focus for strife and intrigue, to me no more an intriguer myself. Can you not guess how great a burden that has been? To be free from the follies of this place, and wander through the world once again, on a great quest, the East. Long have I dreamed of seeing its shores, and the wide ocean over which men first came here from ancient Caris. And you will come with me, will you not? Did I not say you would hear matter to make you think?
Elof stared.
I must follow the path of the sunrise, aye. And where do you think I go? Insisted Kermorven. I need men of mettle in my company. Why should we not set out together? Face the perils of the inner land together, as we did the mountains and the sea. We will surely fare better together than apart. Well, do you hesitate? Not I, Elof laughed. I was taken by surprise, that is all. Of course I'll come, and glad of it. It was loneliness I'd come to fear the most. And you, Ilse? Kermorven turned to her. Will you? But Ilse had vanished from the steps. Many in the streets had seen her, heading back to Kermorven's house. And when he and Elof returned there, the servants assured them she had come in, and not since passed the gate. Yet when they looked for her, she could not be found. Gone from her room was her scant gear, nothing left save a simple message on a table. Fare you well, and may the Shaper speed you, and may we meet again. She has gone, then, said Kermorven unhappily, passing the note to Elof. As she said she would, and secretly, lest we entreat her too greatly to come. Well, I cannot blame her. She has deserved better of this city than it has given her. May we meet again, indeed. But that night, in his bed, Elof drifted out of his dreams, vaguely aware of a shadow that seemed to slip across the floor and bend over him as he lay. Ilse? He mumbled. A quiet chuckle. I awaited the safety of the dark, when I can see you and you humans cannot. Where better than here? But I could not resist. She bent down, and her lips pressed hard against his a moment. He breathed her breath. Fare you well indeed, she whispered, and crushed his hand to her. Her wide eyes gleamed in the blackness. It's only that I cannot. She rose up and vanished. He sat up, suddenly awake, but heard nothing, not even the faintest footfall on the stairs. Only the heat of her breath seemed still to course through him. Found it hard to sleep again. Next morning he was unsure whether or not he should tell Kermorven, but when he went down to breakfast he was saved the decision, for he found Kermorven deep in conversation with a rotund man, blond of hair and beard, and was startled to recognize him as Ermahal, skipper of the Corsairs. Well now, sirs, he corrected himself, with a respectful nod to Elof. There's all kinds of reasons. See, we all of us bought off our outlawry by rescuing the women, fine. And we had a fair whack and booty put by. There's some of the lads turned their share to good use and settled down. Some stopped one in the siege, rest their scabby souls. But others, well, they've shed it one way or the other, through gaming or skirts or whatever. Would I want such fools as followers? Inquired Kermorven. But they're not all of 'em fools, protested Ermahal, tapping his long nose. Some are just plain wild, money or no. Fact is, there was reasons we were outlaws, all of us, and we ain't changed in a day. No, nor a year neither. Piss poor citizens we make, but Corsairs, adventures by sea or land, well, that's another matter. He drummed his fingers on the long table, managing to look at once sly and diffident. You were our real skipper, sir, no gainsaying that. Not that I ever resented it. We've followed you before, and it wasn't us as ran off and left you, was it, sir? But we'd be glad to take up with you again. And you, Sir Smith, he added hastily, bouncing up to bow to Elof. We've seen your mettle, too. Elof smiled.
Lord Kermorven alone is our leader, not I. But how many do you speak for?
Ah,
Said Hall, and began to reckon on his fingers.
About 20, sir. There being some downed by drink or disease.
Too many, I fear, said Kermorven. Our company must be small, its members men of experience. That huntsman, Cassay, might prove useful for one. And there should be some northerners among them, to show that we can fare together in peace. I am having it cried both through the city and the northern camps that we seek such men. Our company must be ready to depart in a matter of weeks.
Hall shrugged. Well, sir, the pick's yours. But I've sailed rivers as well as seas, and that might be useful. I'd be glad if you'd count me in, and Bailey the bosun, you know what a hard nut he is.
Kermorven nodded in amused remembrance. So be it. I'll start my choice with you both. He cut short the skipper's grateful protestations with a lifted hand. Remember, this is no wild venture, wagering peril against a chance of plunder. Death weights the scales, and the greatest prize on our side may simply be survival. Hall plucked at his scanty beard.
Well, I'd settle for that. I've always had a fancy to cast an eye on that eastern ocean. Might be they're short of corsairs in those parts.
Elof laughed, but Kermorven's smile was sterner. Or they may have an excess of gibbets, he said. You are a great rogue, Hall, though a brave one. Leave your corsair's ways here in the west, lest I hang you myself. The fat man chuckled.
Like I was saying, sir, we ain't all changed in a day. But I'll skip to your tune till journey's end.
Do so, or you may dance your last. But you will not go unrewarded if it is in my power. When Hall had gone, Kermorven suggested they take the sun upon the roof a while. Elof sensed why. From there they could look out over the whole city, across the wide squares and high buildings of the old quarter, down along the plunging streets of the newer circles to the half-repaired breach in the outermost wall, and beyond it the dark shading straggling over the plain that was the northerners' town of tents and huts. The sun above was warm, the breeze light, and yet where sky met distant mountain gray streaks mustered. The clouds gather, said Kermorven, and while we are gone they will surely close in further still. There's little enough time left us to save this place. I did not say this to the syndics for fear of closing their minds altogether with scorn. But it may not, as they think, be a matter of summoning Easterners westward. Our wounds are too bloody, our healing too slow. If the Eastlands can offer any refuge at all, it is we who may be forced to flee.
Eastward, aye.
The smithy was hot, for they were casting silver, but nonetheless rock shivered.
Over the mountains and into the forest, league after league of it, and full of who knows what. Run north and there's the wastes in the ice. Run south and there's the wastes in the desert. Freeze or burn, or worse.
That's just what I need, laughed Elof. Encouragement. It's all very well for you. You're not going. Rock put down his ladle with a clatter.
And who in Ella's name will stop me?
Elof stared at him. Are you serious? You are serious. Rock, you're daft. Here you're well settled. You've the best smithy in all this town, and Cathel for a patron. In a year or two, you'll be rich.
Aye, and when I told you as much, it didn't stop you, did it?
Well,
But I've a purpose, Rock.
And haven't I? Growled Rock. I'll be rich, says you. Just in time for the Ekwesh.
Yes, but Rock, this journey must take more than a year at its swiftest. What about Marja? Doesn't she have some say? Rock shrugged.
I never promised her anything. She's no claim on me. She'll have the smithy, of course, and old Joran. They'll manage fine till I get back. She waits, or she doesn't.
Rock, you know well there's a chance you will never get back. I don't want to drag you away.
Understood,
grunted Rock.
But it's my decision, nobody else's. If you're too daft to stay, somebody's got to keep an eye on you. And I fancy a share of the sport this time, see? You won't shake me like you did before.
And indeed, when, some 3 weeks later, the time came to depart, Elof was no nearer managing it. It was a motley group of callers that came knocking on the gates of Kermorvan's house that evening as the sun slid down behind the clouds of early spring. First to arrive were 2 tall men clad in rough green and russet, marked as northerners by their copper skin. Guys and Aisdan were their names, and they hailed from villages far inland, on the margins of the dense northern woodlands. They themselves were foresters, men accustomed to rove free under the shadow of trees, wise in their lore as few Southrons were. They both bore broad falchions, Guy's a short bow of strong wizened horn, and Aisdan an immense long-hafted axe. They were quiet men, exchanging only curt greeting with the noisy corsairs who came straggling in soon after. Though they had obviously been celebrating their departure, it encouraged Elof to see them no worse than merry. Besides Ermahal and Mael, Kermorvan had judged only 3 others sound or trustworthy enough to make the journey. They were all Southrons, men of the sea, but with some experience of wandering on land. Dervis, Ermahal's helmsman, and Peric had been deserters from Bryhane's small war fleet, and Stahan a hand on a trade ship. Borhi, the youngest, had been a fisherman till exiled for killing a man in a drunken brawl. After them came the hunter Kasei, slipping shadow-like into the courtyard, and then 3 more northerners, Tenvar, Boor, and Holvar. Lighter-skinned than the foresters, they were burghers' sons of Saldenberg who had fought in that rich port's brief but heroic defense, and made their way south through many hardships, passing scatheless through the forest's arm. They too were merry, but what worked on them like wine was new hope, a fresh light in eyes that had long worn the dull gaze of the fugitive. Their new garb and weapons put swagger in their step and flourish in their salutes to Kermorvan, seated at his ease beneath the yellow-crowned locust tree in the center of the yard. Last to arrive were Rock and an old Southron of somewhat the same aspect, Arvis, chosen at Cathel's suggestion. He had been a trader of his caravan when Rock and Elof met it, and spoke the northern tongue well. When all this company was assembled, Verhas brought wine. Kermorvan pledged each of the company in turn, and they drank his health. It was no time for greater ceremony. Thoughts of the paths they must tread weighed upon them all, and the only words exchanged now were quiet inquiries about gear and provisions. "We must do our best to slip away unnoticed," Kermorvan had decided. "For one thing, Bryhan's rabble might gather to bid us a warm farewell. For another, if there are any spies about, better they cannot say what time we left, or by what roads." A file of ponies was led out of the old stables, and they busied themselves loading their baggage. Their vestigial side hoofs marked the beasts as of the Northland stock, short of leg and coarse of coat against long-limbed southern breeds. But Elof and the other northerners rejoiced to see them. The southerns were not so sure.
"Sight too free with their flamin' teeth for me,"
grumbled Ermahal, skipping awkwardly out of one irritated beast's way.
"Don't haul on their girths, man," laughed Boer. "It's no longboat you're loading there." "Would it were that I'd have somewhere to kick you off. Give me a solid beast of Brihane any day. These jades are half rat and about as well broken."
"But they will bear even you," grinned Elof, "over ways where your solid Brihane beasts would stumble every second step, and leagues long enough to burst their hearts. Not even Kermorvan's great white warhorse can match them in endurance."
"True," acknowledged Kermorvan. "I would never think to lead her on this rough a journey."
"It's said there are wild horses east of the mountains," said Tenvar mischievously. "Giant ones. Maybe they're tameable. They sound better suited to bear a man of your, presence, Southern."
"Presence,"
growled Ermahal, purpling and rounding on the young northerner. Tenvar stood his ground, smoothing his small mustache nonchalantly, and his fellows moved to join him. Kermorvan's genial voice cut into the silence.
"And of mine. My long shanks lose grace on these little beasts. I am close to walking. But we will miss them soon enough, I reckon. Once within the pathless forest, no horse can help us, and we must be our own beasts of burden then."
It was a sobering thought, and turned each man to securing his baggage once more. But Elof had some skill in reading Kermorvan's impassive face, and whispered, "That was a cut well parried."
"Aye, but spare me any more such. These Saldenberg lads are fools to jest so, though they meant no harm. Ermahal would hardly be a corsair captain if he were a safe man to mock. Elof, you were a northerner of much their age, and they are used to heeding smiths. Do you take them in hand?"
"I'll have them as rear guard then, with Rock, away from the corsairs."
"Do you so? As well to have sharp eyes and live minds there in any event, on the dark paths we must tread."
Kermorvan's gazed about the gloomy courtyard.
Now the sun is all but down. The city's voices grow quiet. The time of our going is here. Home of my fathers, night and silence claims you once more. Shall I ever rest at ease in you again? Yet it must be. It must be. Elof, my friend, it may be that all our trials and troubles so far have been no more than a prelude to this."
"I was thinking the same," acknowledged Elof, "but of my own quest in particular."
Kermorvan nodded. "May that prosper, whatever else betide. Well, all farewells are said save mine. I must not linger."
Then Fairhas and Kermorvan's few other servants came and knelt before him, a thing rarely done in north or south, even before great lords. Yet there was no servility in the gesture, but more of love, for clearly they wept. And when Kermorvan handed over a great ring of keys to Fairhas, they shook and rattled in the old man's hand. Elof saw then something of Kermorvan's shaping, for it was these old servants who had brought him up, as the deaths of his parents and his family left him increasingly alone. He was a lord shaped by vassals, a king molded in the image his followers sought to believe in, all the more so in an age and a place where kingship was no longer welcome. Such an upbringing might have turned out many ways, but in him, to Elof's mind, it had tempered pride and strength with compassion and restraint, and the urgent need to command with reason and respect for those commanded.
"I agreed," said Rock. "Couldn't have been easy, though, growing up a prince with no domain past these four walls. Small wonder he was wild as a lad. But like I told Marja, there's few men else I'd follow where we're bound."
Ferhas was fumbling with the keys now, and even as the gates creaked open, Kermorvan, Guise, and Azdan began to lead out the line of ponies. As had been agreed, the travelers pulled cloaks and hoods about themselves, and slung weapons out of sight. Leading rather than riding their mounts, they would look like many another party of weary fugitives. Ferhas saluted Elof as he had the others, but plucked at his arm and whispered vehemently,
"You'll have a care of him, won't you, sir?"
The idea of himself guarding that fearsome fighting man seemed absurd, but Elof could not laugh at the old esquire. He nodded, clapped him on the shoulder, and passed on. The long caravan ahead was silhouetted against the pale stone of the mansion opposite like figures on a moving frieze, as if already they merged with the faded chronicles of times past. The young northerners were on his heels. He heard the gate creak to, and awaited the sound of the lock. It did not come, and although he would not turn his head, he held clearly in his mind the image of old Ferhas standing there in the wall's black shadow, listening, straining his ears until the last faint hoofbeat had utterly died away. The night was cool, the streets fast emptying. City folk hurried here and there with their smoking link lights, few sparing an eye for the drab procession that clipped and clattered along the cobblestones. The square of the citadel, where tall braziers burned, they skirted, and also the merchants' quarter, still busy and aglow with everything from crystal candelabras in high windows to rush dips and little charcoal ovens in the street stalls. He thought of Cathel, now on the northern borders ordering his new domain, and smiled. The merchant had not gone without giving Rock and himself strict orders to report on the wealth of any eastern lands, and their dearth and surplus of a long line of commodities. "You seem very confident we will find somewhere," Elof had said.
"Course you will, lads."
Cathel had puffed cheerfully, and then remembering perhaps his claim to be the honest, added,
"But, well, it's a poor peddler doesn't knock on even the rickety doors, huh?"
He would miss the man, thought Elof, and if he, too, was honest, he realized he would miss this whole huge, sprawling city as he had never dreamed he would. He rested a protective hand on the saddlebag that held his baggage, meager but heavy, a few garments, a change of boots, but chiefly the things he most valued, a certain gauntlet of mail, his precious tools, and with them a crook-tipped rod of worn bronze, the strange cattle goad that was his only inheritance from his first youth. He had brought that on impulse, not for any use it had, but now he knew why. To here also he might never return. Once a tiny village had been his world, then a lonely tower. The first small towns had seemed overpowering, but this teeming human hive, it could have swallowed them up 1,000-fold. And for all its sins, he had come to see that only out of such a community of men could arise the order and strength of will that was their best shield against the oncoming ice. It made the wild lands beyond its bounds seem that much wilder, and himself more foolish to seek to venture into them once more. Others seemed to be feeling the same. Boor, fond of his food, kept scuttling over to stalls they passed to buy last portions of local delicacies. Elof found it hard to blame him, for the northerners had eaten poorly enough before being chosen for the company. But then he saw Borhi, the corsair, slip across to a wine stall, and Tenvar began chatting to the market girls walking alongside, and he called them back into line.
"That's well done," said Rock. "There's some as'll know us and talk."
"For which I'll wager Lord Bryhan has ears listening," agreed Arvis, dropping back.
"The happier I'll set out without flagstones flying around my ears."
"There's that," admitted Boor, indistinctly, munching spicy chunks of fowl from a skewer.
"Gate's not so far, though, now. The step is full far enough with a mob in the way."
The shadow of the high gate tower might have concealed one easily enough. Now, though, there were few folk about in its shadow, and most of them sentinels of the city guard. But the figure who stepped suddenly out of the shadows was clad in tunic and cloak of richly worked red velvets, and he was very tall. Elof exchanged horrified glances with Rock, and moved swiftly down the column to Kermorvan's side.
"A shame on you, my lord of Morvan,"
was the newcomer's jovial greeting,
"that you sought to slip away thus. Did you think it could be kept from me?"
"I had my reasons, my lord of Briarhen," Kermorvan said coolly. "You, among others. What have you to gain by hindering me?" Teeth flashed in Bryhan's beard.
"I hinder you?"
He sounded affably hurt.
"I came only to wish you well."
Kermorvan sighed, and rested an arm across his pony's back. "My lord, I fail to understand you. That we are hereditary enemies is of little moment in these times. But if the law permitted, I would cheerfully slaughter you for all the wrongs you yourself have done my family. You have ever sought to thwart any plan of mine simply because it was mine. You are no generous adversary. Am I expected to believe you are now?" Bryhan shrugged.
"If you are right, you bring us some small benefit. If you are wrong, you cost us little. I hope you do find survival in the East. Most sincerely I do. Is that to be a crime in your kingdom?"
"Hardly. I accept your good wishes to the extent you mean them, and return such thanks as they are worth, though from one who sought to murder me in secret." Again, Bryhan shrugged.
"In the best interests of the city, as the troubles that followed have proved. But we are warriors of the same high order, you and I. I would not fear to face you if I could, Karen Kermorvan."
"Nor I you, Bryhan Briarhen. Now, may we pass?" Bryhan's deep laugh was wholly genial.
"Am I preventing you? But for all the world I would not. Go, succeed, or be damned to you."
And still chuckling, he turned and strolled off into the dark. Elof glared after him. For a moment, I thought that human mantis meant what he said. "In part, perhaps," mused Kermorvan. "We are of the same order, the same discipline, that one and I. We have endured the same trials, and may speak of them to each other as I may not even to you, a friend. That bond even hatred cannot wholly expunge." He smiled. "But you and I, we have shared our own ordeals, and others no doubt lie ahead. At least we need skulk no longer. Mount up all, and follow. Guards there,
Open the gates.
Open! Stand aside for a lord of the city!
Cried Rock in his powerful voice, and the other Southrons joined him at once. The Northerners, who had known no authority stronger than town elders or guildmasters, smiled to see how the guards scurried to the immense windlasses and set the long weight chains clanking down over the stone, the heavy gates grinding inward. As the first gap appeared, it seemed to Elof that a deeper darkness came spilling in, like the shadow of some vast beast lurking, but a light but chilling breeze. He shivered. But when Kermorven led the column forward beneath the deep arch, he followed gladly enough. He thrilled to the clink of the smoothly metalled high road beneath his pony's hooves, the grating rumble of the gates closing behind them. It was exciting, after all, to be a wanderer once more. He looked up. The sky above was pearled with the full moon rising, but the city walls barred its light. The company plunged into shadow like deep water, dark and cold. Rock looked back at the gate ramparts and nudged Elof. A lone watcher stood there, outlined in silver.
"You good sight by half-light," he grunted. "Who'd that be? 10 for 1 it's that bugger Bryhon."
Elof looked and smiled wryly. A poor wager. Marja. Rock snorted violently, but he dropped back a little, and a moment later, when he thought Elof was not looking, he turned and waved, and for many minutes he would surreptitiously look back. Across the plains of the city the caravan trotted, that Elof had first seen as a gaming board of fields, spacious and rich. But over them had passed the Ekwesh, plundering and destroying beyond all reason, and after them the refugees. They had made their pitiful camps of tent and shack there on land that should have grown food to help support the city. The camps cultivated only a few scant patches and at poor yield, but the blame was the city's. Much waste could have been avoided if it had accepted the Northerners and made use of their willing labor instead of branding them beggars. The thought angered Elof. Kermorven was right. Why had he needed to fight to prove it? What made men so blind to their own best interests? It was long before they passed the last of the little campfires, but longer yet before those fires faded from his thoughts.